Hi. So I'm watching the film The Butler. This is a Lee Daniels film from 2013. This isn't a film review. I think I may have done that before. It's a very good film. It would be probably among my top 20. This is a film. No copyright infringement intended there by showing the cover. It's a Lee Daniels film starring Forrest Whitaker, and it's a true story, although there's some adapt alterations, of course, to historic accuracy. It's basically based on the true story of a black butler who served under, I think, it was 6 or 7 U.S. presidents from the early 50s to the late 80s, going from the Eisenhower administration right up to the Reagan administration. It's got a lot of big names in the film. But anyway, I'm not doing a film review. There's one scene early in the film during the Little Rock standoff, and when civil rights was really starting to escalate from the late 50s onwards. Um, and it shows how freedom riders and others were being trained basically on college campuses what to expect from segregationists, the sort of abuse and violence that they would receive. Um, Now, the film is set, or this particular sequence is set before the events in Selma of 1964-65. This would be about late 50s. It's still the Eisenhower administration. But anyway, in the film, the main character's son, played by David Oyelowo, has a very different view from his father. He thinks they should be far more proactive in terms of the civil rights movement. His father kind of has this optimism that it will gradually happen under the various presidents that he's serving, and he feels that his position as White House butler is securing his family. His son has a very different outlook. He feels that the time is now; they need to act now, and a lot of the film focuses on that father-son relationship and the tensions that they experience as a result. But anyway, it's a very good film. But this particular scene, it shows these freedom riders, these young civil rights activists, go into a diner in the South, it's Tennessee in this case, and basically asked to be served to break the segregation, to break the Jim Crow laws. And of course, they get asked to leave. That doesn't happen, and they stay put. And then later in the evening, and it's quite a hard scene to watch, but it's an important scene. You see these segregationists, these KKK type thugs, not explicitly KKK, but obviously racists. They come in and they start yelling profanities at them. They even squirt tomato ketchup on them, throw hot coffee on them. It's quite hard to watch. But among that is a young white guy, and during the preparation, he has to say to a young black woman, the M word, and he really doesn't want to do it because he's not there for he doesn't like using the word. But they were training him to be prepared for what they were going to face, and that's interesting. It shows that he gets called white M word, and it just reminded me that whilst the segregation and the racism itself was aimed obviously at African Americans, um, throughout the civil rights movement, there were many white Americans who were sympathetic to the cause, particularly after Selma, and this is featured also in the film Selma. It's showing the scene right now. In fact, I won't pan the camera because, well, maybe I can actually put it on mute so I can make the video. So this is the scene. I'll try and keep it as still as I can. Anyway, you get the idea. Um, it's a powerful scene, and it's realistic. That's exactly the sort of thing that did happen. Um, and by the way, no copyright infringement intended. The Butler is released by the Weinstein Company, director Lee Daniels, no copyright intended. Um, During the civil rights movement, like I said, there were many white allies, and in Selma, particularly by the mid '60s, um, there were actually a lot of white Americans, particularly white Northern Christians, who came down to support Martin Luther King, particularly after the brutal images of state troops beating the demonstrators in the Selma March. Now, two of those people who came down was a young Unitarian minister, I believe from Chicago, by the name of James Reeb, and a young Italian American woman, Viola Liuzzo. They were both young, only in their 30s. They came down to support the movement, and they were murdered. They were basically murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, and they're honored by various civil rights museums. Now, this is not to say that the majority of victims weren't black, but the point with this is these were two white Americans, James Reeb and Viola Luzzo, who were, they knew the risks involved. They knew it was dangerous. They knew they could get abuse. And in their case, they paid with their lives. Their lives. So I'm driving a point with this. When organizations like Black Lives Matter try to dig up the wounds from the past, and I believe that they do, I do not see them as the civil rights movement. I think there's something more than that. I see them as more akin to being like the Black Panthers or the, even dare I say it, Nation of Islam than the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. Uh, John Lewis, late John Lewis, said he respected BLM and even praised them. I was somewhat surprised by that, I must admit, because Lewis, of course, was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington. He was a close friend of Martin Luther King Jr. Um, I'm surprised to hear him praising Black Lives Matter because I suspect a lot of what Black Lives Matter come out with, Martin Luther King wouldn't approve of. King was not. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Martin Luther King. One thing was he was kind of this utopian envisaged pacifist who just wanted us to all get on with each other. Actually, the man was a fighter. He was very stubborn, very tough. Um, so this idea of him being a kind of wishy-washy pacifist is, I think, a misconception. However, what King always did strive to push was the idea of a unified society, black and white children coming together. That is the exact antithesis of what Black Lives Matter talk about. Black Lives Matter is in the business of emphasizing differences, of emphasizing victimhood, of emphasizing how awful things are for black people and the terrible whites need to pay. I mean, they are lit, they push for reparations, they push for, I don't know what King's stance was on reparations, but if you look at the ideology of Black Lives Matter, it's not just a civil rights movement and say, look, we're concerned about the way black people are treated by the police, and we want something done about it. They go a lot deeper than that. They want to totally defund the police. They have racist elements that they haven't got rid of, like Yusra Kugali. I keep mentioning her. I know I might sound like a broken record at this point, but I think it's important. She's a senior leader. Why hasn't she been expelled? Um, so I do not see Black Lives Matter as kind of a 2010s, 2020s equivalent of the civil rights movement of the 60s. I really don't. And the point about Black Lives Matter is they polarize many white supporters. I mean, there was a guy, I think it was in Oregon, who said he was very disappointed by the fact Black Lives Matter had not taken action against the racism within. And he was white, and he was very supportive of the movement. He, pretty left wing. He believed that there was institutional racism. I'm sure he still does. He believes that action needs to be taken, police need to be held to account, white people need to acknowledge the challenges that black people face. He went with all that, and yet He was disappointed that Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter's failure to take on the polarizing forces within. Now, I am convinced that any movement that doesn't do that is doomed to failure. Recent study in the UK, 55% of the public, this is from The Guardian, by the way, 55% of the public believe that Black Lives Matter has been damaging to race relations. 55%. And it's not good enough to just dismiss that as right wing reactionary. I know of many left wing people who are not comfortable with Black Lives Matter as a movement. I know black people who are uncomfortable with it. More than uncomfortable with it, they outright oppose it because they think it is a negative force. They think it divides. Um, so I really think that when we're talking about, I'll probably entitle this video White Allies and Black Civil Rights. I think that white people do need to acknowledge where there are injustices. So if you get a situation where an unarmed black man is killed by the police, anger is totally understandable. But I also believe that the narrative that BLM put out, you would think that American society is where it was in the 1960s. And it really, really isn't. So much has changed since then. Yet they put out the narrative that because there is an issue with police power, which by the way affects everyone, but that somehow demonstrates that there is still this overbearing white establishment keeping them down. I think it's a very misleading narrative, um, and I do believe they're fundamentally a divisive force. I would ask Black Lives Matter, what have you actually achieved? What have they actually achieved? But I often think, well, what would I do if it was the 1960s? Would I be among those people, joining the Freedom Riders and so on? Hand on heart, I don't know. I don't know. I'd like to think I would be, but I don't know what my thinking would be at the time. I'd like to think I would be. But anyway, I just think it is deeply insulting when you get black racists then get a free pass. When you get someone like Reni Eddo-Lodge, why I no longer talk to white people about race, that's a generalization. She's saying all white people are the same. She was born in the mid 80s. So those words are an insult to people like James Rabe and Viola Liuzzo. I'm not saying that black people should say thank you. I'm saying they should acknowledge it. They should acknowledge there were white people that risked being beaten, even killed, for what they saw as doing the right thing. I will always oppose racism, and I have seen examples of anti-black racism. For example, in football, I think when you get some drunk white yob makes monkey taunt to a black footballer, that's plain racism, right? Um, Police brutality. There's a lot of cases that my natural instinct is to oppose and say that is wrong. We need to speak up against that. So I sleep well. I know what my conscience is. But I am not going to be silent in criticizing what I do believe is a divisive movement. And apparently most people do. It's just that large segments of the media and political establishment, for want of a better term, have pandered to Black Lives Matter. The BBC had an interview the other day, and what was it? All it was pandering questions. There was no scrutiny. There was no, how do you justify this? Or are you not, what would your answer be to those who say that you're a divisive movement? They don't put them on the spot, really. The BBC is one of the worst for doing this. They just tell Black Lives Matter what they want to hear. They're not doing their job as a broadcaster by holding them to account. I'm not saying they should vilify Black Lives Matter. I'm just saying they should be fair and scrutinize them as they would with any powerful movement. And this is the point. They will say they're standing up to power, but they are powerful. They're influential. I mean, the last year is showing it. I think it's a negative influence, but I would say that they're influential. So, with that comes power. Why have they not been challenged sufficiently? So, this issue of white allies and black civil rights, my answer to that would be it's a bit like male feminists. I think it's admirable that you can, for example, support women's rights. It's admirable that you can oppose anti-black racism and understand, or at least be sympathetic to the challenges that black people face. But I don't think, I really don't think that Black Lives Matter today is comparable to the civil rights movement promoted by Martin Luther King and others. King, of course, wasn't the only one. We sometimes talk about it as King's movement. There were actually others, but of course, King was brutally murdered. So um, it just needs to be remembered. What I would say to black segregationists, black nationalists, and Black Lives Matter activists is white people don't owe you a damn thing, okay? White people need to acknowledge historic racism, and white people need to be against anti black racism, but they don't owe you anything. I do believe that a lot of this narrative with Black Lives Matter is basically about revenge. Like, okay, 400 years we were kept in slavery, we were brutally treated brutally, lynched and so on. Now it's time for revenge. I do believe this is actually about revenge, and that's not going to help anyone.